Tokyo smells of wet coal and boiled barley on the morning the rule changes. Aiko waits in the Kanda Ward ration office with her ledger folded under one arm, the paper gone soft from being opened and closed 100 times a week. A clerk with ink-smudged fingers stands behind a scarred counter and reads the notice twice, as if repetition can blunt its edges. 6 cigarettes per day, he says. 6 for adult men. The stamp comes down, thud, thud, on little rectangles of authority, while elderly men nod and younger ones stare at their shoes. The women do not step forward. Women are not on the list. Somewhere outside, a bicycle bell chimes, and the sound feels like a patient apology the city has learned to make to itself. Across the ocean, rain needles the steel back of a landing ship, tank nosing through Leyte Gulf. Cranes groan, slings sway. A crate stenciled rations. Kay rises from the hold and claps down on the pier. Inside is a doctrine you can eat. Breakfast, dinner, supper units. The heat-tough tropical chocolate bar that refuses to melt in jungle pockets. The small accessory packet with matches, gum, salt, toilet tissue, and 4 cigarettes sealed into each meal. A second lieutenant in white, Claire Malloy, Army Nurse Corps, watches the pallet roll into a tent where canvas walls breathe with the wind. She has learned to read the world by the sound of wood on wood. When crates arrive on time, the boys live more often. It is not a superstition. It is arithmetic with fingerprints. Aiko counts too. 6 for her husband, none for herself. They will do as they always do. One shared at dusk by the cracked window to spare the shoji's edge, another split before bed to make the room smell briefly like a cafe from a younger year. A veteran with one sleeve pinned neatly back takes his ration book with a bow so deep it looks like apology to the floor. Aiko tries to imagine lighting a cigarette with one hand and decides that sorrow would be the third hand he needs. She wonders whether the neighbourhood head will bend the rule for widows and thinks no. The ledger is a more faithful husband than desire. Claire opens a sample K ration with a mess knife and tips the contents into her palm. The chocolate square snaps like something disciplined. The cigarettes crinkle. The accessory packet's tissue is thin, yes, but white, and that whiteness carries a message. Somebody far away thought about dignity in a place that smells of iodine and diesel. A supply sergeant walks past with a clipboard and a farmer's calm. "The line holds, Lieutenant," he says, not meaning the front but the supply chain that runs from Pennsylvania to a plank walkway beaded with tropical rain. "If anything breaks, it won't be this." Tokyo's streets have learned the grammar of shortages. Aiko passes a tobacco shop with its elegant hanging sign intact while the shelves behind it gape. Rumours travel faster than delivery carts. Somebody says a cousin works at the Monopoly office and can find extras. Somebody else says a neighbour traded a kimono hem for a handful of leaf. The ledger rides home under Aiko's arm like a sleeping child. On the trolley, she rests it on her knees and fills in today's columns with small, patient numbers that do not add up to warmth. 2 hours later, Claire writes, crouched behind a crate, while rain sweeps the canvas like a broom. She tells her sister about the bar that tastes a little better than a boiled potato, and does not mention what she has just washed from her hands. She folds the letter around a single ration cigarette because the rule allows it, and because she remembers the way a match's sulphur blooms in an American kitchen. She knows the cigarette may never be smoked. It may be pressed in a book and kept for its smell, proof that someone you love lives in a country that can afford to send small kindness across an ocean. Night comes early. In Tokyo, the ration office shutters scrape closed as if practicing for a final performance. In Leyte, the crane keeps moving because the sea has no respect for men who say, enough. Aiko slips her empty envelope into her sleeve for luck and steps into a wind that steals the heat she saved in her coat's lining. Claire cups a match out of the rain and pulls smoke into her lungs that tastes of paper and promise. 2 women, 2 harbours, the same winter-wide storm breathing between them like a bellows. Somewhere in the distance, a metal fork slides under a new crate, and somewhere else the clerk's stamp falls another time. Between those two blows, something unseen shifts and the century leans, very slightly, toward the boxes. Joe Ramirez, private first class, thumbs a cellophane-wrapped four-pack as if it were a charm he could rub smooth. The squad is staging short of the front, close enough to hear artillery thud and far enough for the rain to make a theatre of everything. Trucks sighing, boots squeaking, ponchos snapping. The quartermaster has promised 3K rations per man per day, breakfast, dinner, supper, and Joe has counted the math the way Marines do when they find a ritual they can carry. 12 cigarettes if you smoke them all, 1 tropical bar to break teeth or fear, 1 paper napkin that looks like Sunday when you hold it just so. He has been told it is planning, not luck. The telling matters. He stuffs the four-pack back into the carton and taps it twice against his helmet. Across the tent, the platoon sergeant is giving the day's weather, terrain and rumour report. Weather, wet, then wetter. Terrain, mud in 5 dialects. Rumour, the island ahead is stone with teeth. Morale is doctrine, the sergeant says, not smiling. If it's in the box, someone fought to put it there. The line gets a few laughs and then becomes policy, because the best jokes do. Joe watches the loader from a 2.5-ton truck roll pallets to a beach dump, watches a corporal with a pencil behind one ear tick boxes on a board, and thinks the war looks less like thunder and more like handwriting. Aiko balances her own pencil between fingers that smell of soap and coal. She has redone the shop shelves to make emptiness look intentional. The tobacco sign creaks as the door opens and closes on patrons who no longer purchase but ask. A girl from the next street whispers about a man who can swap coupons for rice if you know the phrase. Aiko does know the phrase. She also knows the price. Shame later, indigestion now. She writes neat negatives in the ledger and relies on the small economy of kindness. 3 leaves saved for a neighbour's cough, an extra sheet of the thin tissue folded into another woman's pocket with no words. Joe takes apart his dinner unit and lines the pieces in a row like a classroom demonstration. Biscuits, cheese spread, candy, powder, cigarettes, matches, gum. It is not abundance, not exactly. It is certainty, which might be better. The loader backs away, engine complaining, and the platoon hauls boxes to where radios have made a skeleton of wire and orders. The sergeant says the trucks flow from depot to ship to pier to dump to unit because charts say they will, and because men with slide rules and grease under their nails solved the problem 3 years ago. We don't forage, he adds. We arrive. When the rain lifts, Claire walks the medical supply line with a clipboard and checks off what she touches. Plasma, bandages, splints, morphine syrettes, blankets, and those quiet things that make a rough world less cruel. Soap, clean gauze, the white square in an accessory packet. A hospital corpsman jokes that the army can issue dignity by the pound if you know the stock number. Claire laughs and writes the number down anyway. She has learned that a system that can move crates of mercy through surf can probably do anything it decides to do, and she trusts that more than luck, more than prayer. Evening draws the colour out of everything. Aiko locks the register with its loyal clack and walks the alley home with her ledger hugged to her chest. She meets the neighbourhood head-counting coupons in a pool of light and offers a bow so small it can be mistaken for wind. He nods without seeing her, and that too is a kind of rule. She climbs the wooden stairs and stands by the window with her husband while the day's ration burns in the corner like a secret candle they are allowed to enjoy. The smoke smells like habit more than happiness. They say little. The city does not reward speech. On the beach road, Joe pockets 2 cigarettes and keeps 2 for night watch. He folds the tropical bar into the inner pouch of his jacket where warmth cannot bully it into syrup, and tells himself that he will not break it early. "Save the good luck," the radio man says, and Joe answers, "The luck is that it shows up." Generators kick and cough into steadiness. Somewhere in the dark, a truck drops its tailgate, and the wooden note rings true in the wet air. The platoon sergeant lets them smoke before lights out, and the sparks go up like the galaxy a preacher once promised. Joe thinks of handwriting again, names on crates, names on letters, and decides that tomorrow might be legible. The tent breathes with the storm. Claire steadies a boy's hand around a chipped enamel mug and breaks a tropical bar into squares that click like a metronome for pain. "Just this," she says, and the boy nods, jaw working as if he is chewing through wire. Outside, a corpseman hauls a crate into the lee of the canvas and water sheets off the edges in one long hiss that sounds like winter back home. She takes his pulse again, taps the watch, and lets her eyes flick to the stacked K rations where the printed words are a comfort. Breakfast, dinner, supper. She knows the labels by heart and loves them for their refusal to improvise. A supply sergeant with the calm of a plough horse steps into the light, drops his hat and says, "Ma'am, we've got you for 48 hours without a hiccup." Claire has seen hiccups, boats late, pallets mismarked, a road churned into porridge by 1,000 tyres, and she has learned how rarely the line stays broken. The sergeant speaks in a grammar of intervals and buffers, truck turnaround times, ship arrivals offset by weather, extra accessory packets because men forget where they tuck matches when the shells begin. He does not boast, he outlines. They both understand that mercy gets cold and stiff if left in the rain. She writes to her sister after midnight, when the tent quiets into a hum of breathing and canvas and far-off engines. The letter is a list of small things, because the big things refuse to fit between margins. She writes about the cigarettes, 4 in every meal, 3 meals every day, as if someone wanted to ensure there is always one left for a friend, and about the way the chocolate is formulated so it will not melt in a pocket or on a tongue that cannot manage anything softer than duty. She does not say war because it is everywhere in the letter anyway. When she finishes, she lets herself think about the numbers the sergeant carries like a rosary. In 1943, American factories rolled roughly 290 billion cigarettes, nearly 800 million a day, and packed them into cartons, crates, trucks, ships, hands. The figure glows behind her eyes the way a lighthouse glows, regular and patient. She tries to imagine a nation thinking at that scale and finds that she can, because she works beneath its proof. Stacked boxes, orderly ink, the right item in the right corner of the right crate. The comparison comes uninvited, Tokyo ration lines and 6-a-day coupons, and she feels a stern kind of pity that holds steady and does not spill. At dawn, a convoy grinds through mud that tries to keep it. The drivers back to within inches of the tent fly and grin under caps beaded with rain, and the loaders move with that practiced slowness men use when speed would break the rhythm. Claire checks off plasma, bandages, sulphur, more rations. She palms a 4-pack for a wounded Marine whose hands still shake even after the morphine settles him lower on his stretcher. He thanks her with a look that is almost embarrassment and asks if she will mail a letter he cannot write yet. "Yes," she says, and tucks the promise into the same pocket where she keeps her pencil. Aiko, miles and worlds away, watches smoke leak from chimneys into a sky the colour of old lead. She has heard the new jokes, 6 for men, none for laughter, and pretends to smile at them. She slices yesterday's bread thinner and makes tea 3 degrees paler and tells her husband that the stove burns better when you talk to it. The ledger lies open on the counter with its clean lines and faithful sums. She believes in honesty because it is the one luxury the city cannot seize. Claire ends her shift near noon and stands beneath the fly to watch rain beads string themselves into a curtain. The quartermaster's men are moving medical crates to one side, rations to another, and she has the pleasing sense that the world is not chaotic but merely large. She lights a cigarette and thinks of the distance between a factory bell in Pennsylvania and the ember at the end of this paper tube. She can hear the boy inside the tent breathing like someone pacing a hallway. She flicks ash, takes another draw, and feels the line hold. If the small things arrive, she thinks, the big things are already here. She exhales into the rain, and the smoke blows sideways, a faint grey report on a victory still being written in numbers and names. Cinders drift like grey moths when the sirens die. Aiko stands with her neighbours in a lane where one side of the street still has faces and the other is a dented black absence, and the ration office opens on time because the clock is the last loyal thing the city owns. The clerk's stamp thuds more softly today, as if tired. 6 per day for men, the notice still says, but deliveries have grown thin enough that the neighbourhood head uses a word everyone hates, chien pei, non-delivery, and people nod as if the syllables themselves could feed them. Women ask with their eyes. The answer does not change. She walks past the tobacco shop whose elegant wooden sign swung through the raid without catching fire. Inside, the shelves are orderly and bare. The owner counts coupons that cannot buy anything, his lips moving as if prayer might summon shipment. Aiko steps in, bows, and leaves without speaking because conversation now feels like theft. Outside, soot has powdered the tops of vegetables in the market until they look like a diorama of winter. She thinks of the veteran with one sleeve pinned up taking his ration with a dignity that weighs as much as a full pocket should. The air raid pamphlets fall like fragile feathers from a polite enemy. Their paper is better than local stock, smoother, more certain. Aiko uses one to reinforce the ledger's back and wonders whether, when peace arrives, people will keep their notebooks anyway, the way some sailors keep their sea legs as a habit. She records what can be recorded and learns not to write the rest. Meanwhile, rumours crowd each other in alleys. A cousin in Yokohama saw a train with tobacco, a man in Ginza knows a woman in the Monopoly office, a neighbour swapped silk for a week's supply and did not tell her mother. The city rehearses desperation with excellent manners. On the other side of the ocean the weather is ugly, but the schedule is precise. Liberty ships stand off, while LSTS fatten the beach dumps. Pallets come off in their turn and are rescued from surf by men who call to each other as if the water speaks their language. Claire signs for medical boxes and watches a sergeant nail a sign over one stack, "Do not expose to sun." The admonition feels almost comic in rain you could drink with a spoon. She helps shoulder a crate anyway, and the weight is truthful in a way a paragraph will never be. Aiko takes her turn in the ration office when the line has dwindled to people who cannot be disappointed again today. The clerk tells her gently what she already knows and asks after her bookkeeper's ink, as if the conversation could be another kind of ration. She thanks him and steps into air that smells of wet plaster and wood smoke. On her way home, she cuts through a shrine yard where the gravel, always raked, shows no footprint but hers. The quiet there is shaped like a room you are allowed to enter without knocking. She stands beneath the eaves and lets rain rest on her sleeves, then returns to the street to resume belonging to the city. Night comes with a suddenness that feels personal. She and her husband split a single cigarette into 2 thin evenings, break it and save the second half in a saucer, and smile at the ridiculous pose of plenty. She thinks of the arithmetic, 6, then less, perhaps 3 soon, and does the math in her head as if she can correct the sum with neatness. Far away, men eat from cartons that never apologize for being full. The thought pricks, but does not wound. She closes the ledger and smooths its cover, grateful for an object that keeps its shape. She sleeps lightly and wakes to a sky that looks scrubbed and tired. The shop opens. Neighbours come and do not buy. She writes down their arrivals anyway, a record of presents, and makes tea that tastes mostly of heat. A flyer curls in the doorway, and she uses it to level a crooked stool, then stands behind the counter with her hands folded until the clock says that another day has found its ending on time. She locks the door, counts the coins that do not change, and steps into streets that gleam like lacquer. Somewhere, she reminds herself, the storm that crossed an ocean is still at work, throwing rain against steel and canvas, and the world it waters is not the same as hers. She breathes deep and tastes ash and thinks of patience as a kind of strength you practice because you cannot buy it. The sea slicks the ramp with a bright skin that looks like oil and might be hope. Joe crouches behind the bow door with his rifle angled across his knees, listening to the coxswain call distances in a voice so bored it sounds heroic. When the door bangs open, the surf runs at them like a mistake they meant to make. He follows Boots into water that tries to suck him down and then stumbles into sand that is already busy with men and orders. The smell is diesel, salt, cordite, and the fresh wood of crates whose seams are still honest. A loader waves an LVT closer, and a pallet swings ashore with the impatience of everything that matters. They say the first hour was easier than rumour promised, which only means the second hour kept its word. Mortars begin to feel the beach with stubby fists. Joe learns the shape of the ground fast. Low sand ridges that pretend to be walls, gullies that collect shrapnel and sweat. He rips a dinner unit open and lays out the familiar list: biscuits, cheese spread, candy, powder, matches, gum, 4 cigarettes, and chews gum hard enough to trick his mouth away from panic. The platoon sergeant points with the stem of a pipe he never lights and talks about fields of fire, dead ground, and why the good cover is usually already taken by the first man who knows he is going to live. By late afternoon, the beach dump has a personality. Trucks back and curse, pallets multiply. Someone hangs a sign that says supply because it is comforting to name what you own. Joe hauls ammo in exchange for a cardboard sleeve of water purification tablets, pockets 2 cigarettes against night, and gives one to the barman who cracked his canteen on the ramp. The sky forgets to be blue, and the rain remembers that it has a job. The crate he is carrying says rations, K, assorted in letters that reassure him like a familiar radio voice. They dig in on a patch of ground that pretends to be higher than the sea. The mortar rounds come without malice. Joe learns to count the spacing between thumps and lets the counting be a kind of prayer. He trades a stick of gum for a length of shelter-half rope to help keep the poncho stretched, and trades a cigarette for the silence of a man who would otherwise talk about the past. The radio checks are a metronome in the dark. The net breathes like a living thing. Somewhere down the line a Marine laughs too loudly, and the sound dies as if the rain swallowed it. Night watch is a ritual. Joe saves 2 cigarettes for his 2 hours and tucks the tropical bar deeper in his jacket, telling himself he will not break it unless the hour asks a price he cannot otherwise pay. The sergeant walks the line and tightens a tarp here, taps a helmet there, adjusts a field of fire with a word. "We arrive," he says again, and the sentence feels like the kind of order that cannot be countermanded because it has already happened. Behind them, the beach dump keeps breathing trucks into the dark. A forklift clacks and backs and clacks again, patient as an ox. Logistics is a creature that sleeps with one eye open. Near dawn, the rain peters into mist and the ground smells like wet pennies. Joe tears open a breakfast unit with stiff fingers and lights the first cigarette with a match he protects like a newborn bird. The smoke takes the edge off the taste of tinned eggs. He hears the barman snore once and stops himself from laughing. The radio man is already unrolling wire like thread from a seamstress's spool, and the platoon's world expands as the antenna finds its height. The first trucks appear as silhouettes where the sea pretends to end. They bring more boxes. He thinks, irreverently and then with gratitude, that if a nation can push cigarettes and chocolate into a storm and onto a beach, it can probably push anything. The rain does the talking on the ridge. It drums on helmets and fills foxholes and beads on the torn foil Joe has learned to fold into tiny boats when the hour is too long. Downslope, the enemy watches the same weather with different eyes. Corporal Saito Kenji moves along a trench chiselled from clay that bleeds red when it rains and counts what his squad has left. Rice gone to paste, a bottle of iodine that smells like metal and hopelessness, and a small roll of tobacco that must serve for another week. He tucks it back into its waxed paper and pretends the act itself adds weight. A skirmish unties itself in the afternoon and knots again by dusk. When it is over, Joe's platoon pushes a few yards forward into ground that has not decided whom it belongs to. In a shallow drawer, he finds an American shelter half collapsed over a puddle, a K-ration carton half full, and 2 accessory packets that must have slipped from a torn sleeve. He calls out and no one answers, so he kneels and inventories the accident. Matches, gum, tissue, salt, cigarettes, the little treasures that men use to buy 5 more minutes of steadiness. He pockets a 4-pack for the barman and 2 sticks of gum for a corpsman who chews when he cannot sleep. Saito's patrol edges into the same drawer when the light goes sour. He reads the wreckage like a book and finds, to his surprise, not weapons but wrappers, the silver and brown ghosts of meals that arrived whether a man had time to eat them or not. He picks up a tropical bar still in its paper, weighs it, and thinks of the private who has not spoken since morning. He presses the bar into the man's hand and does not say eat. He knows the texture will be cruel and the calories will be kind. He tells himself discipline tastes like wax sometimes. Joe lights a cigarette with hands that shake more from cold than fear and lets the smoke warm the back of his throat. He remembers the sergeant's arithmetic. 3 K rations a day, 4 cigarettes per meal, 12 if you want them. A rifle company on full K rations, 180 men, would hold, unopened and open, more than 2,000 cigarettes by nightfall. He does the division and understands the bitter geometry, that one day's company allotment would equal what 360 Japanese adult men could legally receive under the late war quota of 6 apiece. He feels the number like a weight and a permission. It is not gloating, it is understanding. Saito, crouched under the shallow lip of clay, strikes a captured American match and draws on a captured American cigarette. The taste is smoother than home. He exhales and watches the smoke trail into rain and thinks of the ration lines his wife must join, the 6 per day promise that the neighbourhood head enforces with a sigh he cannot control. He saves the last third of the cigarette for later because habit is stronger than despair. In the near distance, an engine coughs, and he recognises the stubborn rhythm of trucks that do not accept weather as law. Claire moves through the aid station, laying hands and eyes where they are needed most. A Marine comes in shivering so hard his teeth sound like hail, and she slides a blanket over him and nestles a 4-pack into his palm as if it were a talisman. "Save one," she says, "for tomorrow." He smiles because the order makes tomorrow a scheduled thing. She steps outside, and the ridge shows itself in brief humours, flares that paint edges, rain that edits them again. She thinks of the numbers she has learned to carry, ship schedules, truck counts, the way the line bends but does not break. She thinks, not for the first time, that waste and reserve look like twins when you only glance. The night takes its shape. Joe makes his 2 cigarettes last the watch and breaks the tropical bar finally, not because hunger insists, but because the hour does. The waxy sweetness steadies his breathing. He lets a square dissolve and listens to the wire sing under rain where it crosses a broken branch. Saito fingers the edge of the remaining American cigarette and tucks it back into its paper. He will give it to the private in the morning and pretend that generosity is strategy. Dawn will find both lines damp and stubborn and supplied to their inescapable degrees. The wrapper flutters once on the drawer's puddled skin and then sinks, and the rain walks on, impartial as a clerk's stamp and as regular as the arrival of crates. The pallets wore their own weather, a saline sheen, a sawdust crust, a trickle of rain that purled and ran as if the black stencils repelled it. Claire walked the row with a clipboard hugged to her ribs and the certainty of someone who has learned that lists can be weapons. The quartermaster sergeant beside her moved at a farmer's pace, pausing to thump a crate to snug a tarp until the grommets sang. "Push, not pull," he said, like liturgy. "We send what you'll need before you ask for it." Beyond the dune, the ocean kept its baseline, but under it ran the deeper surf of engines. A 2.5-ton truck coughed, settled, and reversed with the clean arithmetic of a practiced driver. Chocks out, bed down, slings slack, pallets kissed the earth and became geometry instead of tonnage. Claire checked off medical, sterile, then rations, K, assorted, then bales of accessory packets tied like city newspapers. A corporal read codes without looking, plant, lot, pack date, routing. His voice made the wood sound alive. In the medical tent, the air shifted from iodine and diesel to something almost domestic, folded cotton, brown paper, the faint bitter sweet of the tropical bar she kept for the boy who wouldn't swallow anything softer than duty. She had learned to ration mercy by a schedule. 20 minutes for a dressing change, 3 minutes for the sentence that steadies a man's hands, 10 seconds for a cigarette slid into fingers that have remembered how to shake. Numbers governed everything, and when they arrived on time, they felt like kindness. "Forecast calls for mud," the sergeant said, consulting a clipboard that showed no clouds, only schedules. "Fragile first." He meant plasma, sulfur, sterile dressings, then rations wrapped so the rain ran off like a reprimand that would not stick. He traced the route with a pencil stub, ship to beach dump to distributing point-to-unit trains to companies. "Turnaround on the deuce and a half is 12 hours if the roads keep their skeletons. If they don't, we make bones out of logs." Claire loved the way he spoke. Problems turned into carpentry. A logistics lieutenant from G4 arrived with grease pencil and a grin. Calories marched on his board, water tonnage stacked like cordwood, cigarette allowances nested in accessory, issue, normal. When Claire asked if 4-packs were doctrine, he shrugged. "You don't write morale in bold on a plan," he said, "but you can count it by how many men ask for a light." They paused at a rack of tarps stitched with extra tie-outs by someone who once listened to wind and decided to argue forever. The sergeant pinched a grommet. "That corner holds in a typhoon." Beyond the dune, LST cranes turned in deliberate arcs, lowering problems already solved. Pallets came off with the inevitability of tide, only kinder. If a crate split, the crew blamed a nail pattern, not fate. Systems took the blame, so people didn't have to. Claire retied a bale of packets and breathed the dry paper smell that recalled a county library where war had been a headline. She pictured the path, a Pennsylvania plant to a siding to a port, to a ship that wore barnacles of orders to this beach where sand tried to drink everything it touched, so a private in a trench could find a tissue and for 1 minute not feel filthy. She didn't think. She knew. A free country had remembered the handkerchief. By afternoon, the depot looked like a city that had decided to remain temporary out of humility. Wire, signs, traffic discipline, whistles instead of shouting. A truck arrived with the social rumble of a neighbour. The driver handed Claire a mailbag. "Mail keeps the line straight," he said, and she heard the truth in it. A clerk called names. Each yes stitched something invisible. The sergeant pointed inland. "Push before the storm. If it hits, the boys ride it out with full pockets." Claire pictured watches steadied by chocolate and smoke, morphine given on time because the canvas stayed dry, a match flaring exactly when it should. Evening was more a colour than a time. The tarps warned, the ropes answered, the ocean promised cruelty, the depot replied that it had learned endurance. Claire slipped the tropical bar into her pocket and felt its ridges through cotton. Somewhere a whistle blew shift change, and a forklift's reverse alarm peeped like a mechanical bird that refused extinction. The first convoy rolled, tailgates clapping like a litany, carrying mercy forward on shoulders that had learned the routes by heart. Behind them, cranes dipped and rose, already feeding tomorrow. In the failing light, the stencils showed dull and certain. Rations, K, assorted, medical, sterile. Accessory, small comforts. It wasn't poetry, but Claire knew poetry when she heard it. It was a free republic remembering to send handkerchiefs and cigarettes with its steel. She clicked her pencil shut, squared her clipboard, and stepped back into the tent where numbers kept their promises. Ash fell like patient snow the morning the neighbourhood head said the word no ledger could soften, Chien Pei, non-delivery. The ration office opened on time anyway, because clocks were the last loyal machines the city owned. Aiko stood with neighbours whose faces looked powdered, whose coats smelled of damp plaster and wood smoke. The clerk's stamp thudded as if tired. The notice still promised 6 cigarettes per day for adult men, but the promise had become a rumour that wore a uniform. Women watched with their hands folded. The air was crowded with silence. She walked past the tobacco shop, whose elegant carved sign had swung through the raid unburned. Inside, the shelves were arranged with the neatness of prayer, absolutely bare. The owner counted coupons that could not buy anything, lips moving as if arithmetic could manufacture smoke. Aiko bowed and left without words. In the market, vegetables wore soot like a second skin. She brushed a daikon with her sleeve and left a clean stripe that looked obscene. Rumours passed each other at the alley corners. A cousin in Yokohama had seen a train, a woman in Ginza knew a man in the Monopoly office, an uncle had sold a family comb for 6 cigarettes. The city rehearsed desperation with excellent manners. Aiko trimmed yesterday's bread thinner, made tea 3 degrees paler, and lied to the stove about its kindness. The ledger lay open on the counter with its faithful columns. She recorded arrivals and departures because they existed, even when goods did not. In the evening, she and her husband broke a single cigarette in half and set the second stub in a saucer, a parody of plenty. Smoke seeped through the cracked window and was folded immediately back by a draft that had learned the schedule of their small luxuries. She told herself that habit was a form of courage. The next raid drew its red pencil across the district and left erasures where houses had been. The office opened on time. The stamp fell. 6 became 5. Then, whispers said, would become 3. Men nodded, as if a smaller number, stated clearly, was still a kind of mercy. Women learned the shape of waiting rooms without benches. Aiko saw a young wife tuck her husband's ration into her sleeve and understood the algebra of love. 6 divided by fear equals 2 people pretending the taste was enough. Across the water, ships stood off and LSTS fattened the beach dumps. The schedule held like netting. Claire signed for plasma and for the quiet cargo that saved tempers. Soap, tissue, a wrapped square of chocolate made to endure a hold, a pocket, a palm. In Aiko's alley, the black market practiced bravery with downcast eyes. Silk became cigarettes. A lacquered box from a grandmother's wedding became 5 days' smoke for a father who coughed blood. The ledger recorded the exchange as if it were ordinary. The numbers behaved while the world did not. News travelled like a cold wind, Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. The city, accustomed to absence, learned a new vacancy, the kind that takes words with it. The ration office still opened on time. Chien Pei showed up more days than not. Aiko reinforced her ledger's spine with an American leaflet whose paper was shockingly smooth. She did not read it. She needed the stiffness. She told herself the war would end the way a machine winds down. Slower, then a faint click. She sharpened her pencil and waited for the click. On a night rinsed clean by hard rain, a neighbour admitted she had traded her kimono hem for a handful of contraband smokes. Aiko did not judge. She measured tea for 2, poured it carefully, and set the saucer between them like a candle they were not allowed to light. When her husband slept, she went to the window and watched fog roll along the street, carrying the smell of damp tatami and extinguished stoves. She thought of the arithmetic, 6, then 5, soon 3, and realised the ledger could not forgive, only remember. The city needed forgetting, and could not afford it. The sirens stayed quiet one morning, as if embarrassed. The office opened. The stamp fell with its familiar soft violence. Aiko took her place in line out of respect for order, then stepped aside out of respect for truth. She walked home by the shrine path where the raked gravel never recorded footsteps for long. Under the eaves she counted her breaths until the air no longer tasted like a burned letter. Then she went inside, wrote down what had not arrived, and thought, "When peace comes, the ration book will not float upward and disappear. It will sink in a drawer like a stone." She closed the ledger, turned the key, and listened for the click the city kept postponing. Rain stitched the ridge into one piece, and the trucks cut the seam open again. Joe watched the convoy nose through the scrub like blunt ships, tailgates slapping a steady hymn. The crate men moved with practiced slowness, the only way to be fast when mud pulled at your ankles and the air pretended to be water. A beach dump that had been a rumour was now a creature with a schedule. Intake, stack, dispatch, repeat. A fork's tines bit, a crate rose, a man guided it with 2 fingers as tender as any surgeon's. The line breathed. He had learned the new catechism by doing 3K rations per man per day, 4 cigarettes each meal, 12 in the pocket if you didn't trade any away for rope or coffee. He didn't think about abundance, he thought about certainty. The barman kept 2 for the midnight watch and tucked one in his boot, for the war after this one. The radio man rolled wire off his forearm and said the net would sing once the antenna came up. Claire's aid station ran like a pantry in a storm. Everything labelled, everything where it belonged, a relief map in boxes. She measured mercy in minutes, and grams and matches struck under a cupped hand. The storm flexed. A truck bogged, was winched, complained, and returned to its place in the paragraph. The quartermaster men shifted the load plan without ceremony. Redundancy was not a boast, it was a habit. When one road failed, another shouldered the sentence. Joe carried ammo until his arms remembered factory work, then carried medical boxes until his breath sounded like a pump that had finally primed. He opened a supper unit with his teeth and let the tropical bar sit in his palm like a hot stone before biting down. Waxy, bitter, perfect. The sugar sharpened the world. The sergeant said, not for the first time, that winning a beach was easy. Holding a ridge in weather was where the Republic proved its engineering. Joe believed him because the truck that should have been late wasn't. A forklift's alarm peeped like a ridiculous bird that somehow never died. Far off, artillery stitched a new hem in the horizon, and Saito's line tightened against it. The enemy fought like stone fights, by resisting until your hands forget how to shape anything. They were competent, disciplined, and running out of everything that made courage last through the second hour after midnight. On a lull, Joe did the arithmetic that had frightened him once and steadied him now. In 1943, American factories rolled roughly 290 billion cigarettes, about 800 million a day. Call it 33 million an hour. He tried to picture a number that large and failed, so he pictured a clock. The big hand sliding, the little hand stubborn. Every hour another mountain of paper and tobacco turned into morale. It felt like sorcery, but it was only payroll and planning and 1,000 rail sidings that did not break. The impossible statistic made the ridge feel smaller and kinder. A crate split. The men laughed, not because it was funny, but because it meant the line would keep going anyway. They salvaged, reboxed, moved on. Claire's tent took in 3 shivering Marines, 2 with the 1,000-yard stare and 1 with the 1,000-yard teeth chatter. She slid a 4-pack into a palm and said, "Save one for morning." The words scheduled daylight. Outside, the convoy finished its paragraph, period after period of tailgate thumps. Joe smoked a watch cigarette and thought how the match's flare felt like a signal sent backward, all the way to a factory whistle in a town that still had breakfast. Saito watched the same rain with different eyes. He counted the squad's tobacco, short again. He ordered 2 drags per man, and they obeyed, because obedience could look like hope from across a puddle. He found a square of American chocolate in a culvert and gave it to the quiet private. The boy chewed like it hurt, and then closed his eyes. Saito felt the arithmetic as insult and admission both. He didn't hate the enemy's abundance. He hated the proof it offered about tomorrow. Darkness settled like damp wool. The ridge breathed. Joe made his second watch cigarette last to the ember, then stabbed it into a coffee tin to keep the glow from becoming a target. The radio net sang, a thin metallic hymn about units and grids and time. A truck downshifted somewhere low, stubborn as a plough animal that had decided to outlive the weather. The conveyor belt, invisible and everywhere, kept moving. Joe tucked the last square of chocolate under his tongue and listened to rain on canvas and thought, if a nation can push handkerchiefs and cigarettes through this storm to this ridge on this night, there isn't a thing it can't do in the morning. The radio said it softly. Surrender. The city took the word like a pill too large to swallow and let it sit in the throat. Sirens stayed quiet. Trams rang their bells as if time had resumed. The ration office opened on schedule because that was what it knew how to do. Aiko stood in line and watched the clerk's hands move with their familiar, tired grace. The stamp rose and fell. Chian Pei still appeared on the ledger more days than not. War ended, waiting did not. Occupation uniforms appeared in 2s and 3s, men walking their beats with the ungainly care of visitors who did not want to break anything they couldn't fix. Aiko watched one soldier kneel to tie a child's shoe. Another reached into a pocket and offered a wrapped square of chocolate with a shyness that surprised her. The girl accepted it solemnly, then bit and blinked as if the taste were both coltish and official. Claire, now to the north with a detachment, signed for medical stores and for boxes of rations headed inland where roads had learned the habit of giving way. She watched a GI break his tropical bar and pass half to a woman whose bow looked like an apology to gravity. Comfort had outlived the fighting. The notices changed shape without changing the ache. Men still on the ration, women outside it. The neighbourhood head promised that adjustments were under consideration. Aiko felt her gratitude move like a tide when he spoke to the old women with patience. The black market collapsed and sprouted at the same time, as if shame and relief had shaken hands. Silk came back out of drawers and then went away again. Aiko sold the lacquered comb she had not sold in summer and bought charcoal enough to be warm for a week. She walked home with the bundle like a baby and told her husband the stove would be kinder now. He smiled at the invention. Claire wrote home about the quiet heroics of administration. Warehouses catalogued, roads surveyed, bridges coaxed into usefulness with rope, planks and stubbornness. She watched a Japanese sanitation crew shovel sludge from a canal while an American lieutenant stood by with a clipboard and a dictionary, both men sweating through a still morning that smelled of old fish and new paper. Logistics crossed languages faster than speeches. She learned to say thank you properly and to wait until after bowing to offer a cigarette. The exchange made sense, courtesy for courtesy, smoke for time. Relief shipments nosed into harbours that still wore burn scars around their mouths. Grain came in sacks stamped with letters Aiko could not read. Trucks distributed by rule and by common sense. Lines formed and behaved. The word for non-delivery showed up less often, and then some weeks not at all. Aiko found herself rereading the ledger's pages as if moving backward could summon a world with fewer erasures. She kept the American leaflet as the ledger's spine. It had the right stiffness for a book that had decided to survive. One afternoon in late autumn, she stood outside the shop and watched two MPS try to make friends with a cat. The smaller one produced a cigarette and struck a match. The sulphur smell carried her back to a courtyard where there had been laughter and someone had played a shamisen badly. He saw her watching and offered the cigarette with a question in his eyes. She shook her head and bowed. He looked puzzled, then reached into his other pocket and produced a square of chocolate. She had never wanted to take anything from a stranger in a uniform. She took it. It tasted waxy and sweet, like being told a hard truth in a kind voice. Claire's detachment prepared to rotate. She stood in a warehouse that had been a temple of absence and now had aisles. She watched a Japanese foreman count aloud while an American corporal checked boxes on a clipboard. Numbers, she thought, could become a language of amends if you let them. She handed the foreman a 4-pack and he tucked it into his breast pocket as if it were an old friend returning from a long voyage. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The warehouse made a sound like a ship breathing. On the first winter morning, cold enough to surprise your teeth, the ration office opened again. Aiko stood in line because habit is how you tell the day what to do. The stamp fell, the clerk nodded, she bowed, and she walked home past the shrine where the gravel still remembered nothing for more than an hour. She set the ledger on the counter and traced a finger down a column that had learned to say yes more often. It felt like rain after drought, not enough and everything at once. She boiled water, warmed her hands over the steam, and thought that peace, like war, arrived in boxes and was signed for by people who understood the weight of promises. The canvas flap lifted and the tent breathed a new smell, wet wool, stale smoke, the metallic tang of dried blood. Claire motioned them in, one Marine on a litter, another walking with the guilty gait of the uninjured, and a Japanese corporal bandaged around the ribs, escorted by 2 MPS who had learned the art of looking elsewhere. "Set him there," she said, and the men did as if she outranked the weather. Joe stood in the doorway long enough to feel the shift from rain to lamp warmth. He nodded to Claire and she to him, a battlefield friendship conducted almost entirely in logistics. She broke a tropical bar with a penknife, the pieces clicking like a metronome. "Small bites," she told the wounded Marine, and he obeyed the way you obey instructions that sound like salvation. She slid a 4-pack into his hand. "Save one for morning." The words penciled daylight onto his next page. She crossed to the Japanese soldier. "Corporal Saito Kenji," one MP said, haltingly. Saito's eyes were clear and tired. Claire lifted his hand, placed a square of chocolate in it, and mimed chewing. He understood and looked embarrassed by the kindness. Joe took a step forward, produced his watch cigarettes, and held them out. Saito hesitated, then accepted one, then, after a breath, offered the second to the Marine on the litter. The exchange felt like a truce you didn't have to sign. Claire struck a match cupped in her palm. Both men leaned in, their faces briefly lit the same human colour. Mercy took measurements. Claire checked Saito's bandage, edges clean, seepage minimal. She refreshed the Marine's morphine syrette notation with a stub of pencil. She spoke supply as fluently as sympathy. Outside, a forklift peeped its ridiculous alarm and reversed. The tent canvas answered with a sigh. Joe looked at the rack of accessory packets and felt, not for the first time, that the Republic had found a way to package consideration. He thought of the impossible arithmetic he had learned to carry without flinching. American factories in 1943 rolling about 800 million cigarettes a day, Hershey turning out tens of millions of bars a week by war's end. The numbers were not bragging, they were bridges. Saito watched the Marine's eyes relax around the cigarette. He inhaled carefully, exhaled like someone praying not to be obvious. He thought of a ration office where women had waited without being on the list. He thought of a wife who would someday hold a chit with her own name because the calendar had finally permitted it. He drew again, then pinched the ember and tucked the remainder back into its paper. He had always been good at saving. Claire poured water from a dented kettle and made something that called itself tea. The steam lifted the tense smell toward tolerable. She passed cups to both men and to Joe, then wrote 3 lines in the notebook that kept her days obedient. She looked from face to face and saw the same fatigue housed in different uniforms. "You'll both sleep," she said, and they nodded because the order fit. Outside, rain slackened to a hush. Somewhere a mailbag thumped onto a table, and a clerk called a name that made someone sit up straighter. The MPs shifted and pretended to study the seam where canvas met pole. Joe asked Saito, in slow English and with 2 careful gestures, where he was from. "Shizuoka," Saito said, and smiled a little when Joe said coffee and then pantomimed a mountain. Claire thought of the way maps fold enemies into neighbours when the fighting stops. She checked Saito's pulse and marvelled again at how alike wrists feel under a nurse's fingers. Lights dimmed 3 degrees when the generator hiccuped and recovered. Claire set the penknife on the crate, squared the tin of dressings on instinct, and listened to the rain negotiating with the ropes outside. "Rest," she told them, and the tent arranged itself around the command. Joe stepped into the night, exhaled, and watched the smoke ascend like a fragile truce. Saito cradled the saved half-cigarette in its paper, as if it were a promise he was determined not to break. In the quiet, the arithmetic felt simple. Grams and minutes, matches and miles, small mercies multiplied until they looked like strategy. In spring, the ledger learned a new word. Women, it said, finally, officially, would receive cigarette rations. Aiko stood at the counter and accepted the chit with both hands, not because it was heavy, but because history is. She walked home slowly, letting the paper warm to her palm. The stove ticked in welcome. She set water to boil and waited for the small pleasure to become legal in her own mouth. Outside, a bicycle bell chimed the same soft apology the city had been making since the first notice went up. This time, the apology felt like a bow rather than a flinch. News travelled differently now, less like rumour, more like schedule. Rationing did not vanish, it thinned, and then, at last, let go. The ledger stopped saying kakuhai and started saying yes. Aiko kept writing because the act had become a way to honour the years that hadn't balanced. She inserted the chit into its envelope as carefully as a photograph. Claire, stateside for the first time in what felt like another century, walked through a factory tour where rollers turned paper into cylinders and cylinders into comfort. A guide said numbers that still sounded like boasts, even when softened by gratitude. Billions of cigarettes in a year when the need had been greatest. Billions of chocolate bars stamped, wrapped and shipped to men and women whose pockets had become the endpoints of a continent-sized promise. The memory of the ridge arrived unbidden when she heard a forklift's peep in a loading bay and smiled at the ridiculous bird that refusal had kept alive. She thought of Joe, who had written from a stateside barracks that the worst sound to miss was a tailgate clap in rain. She folded his letter into the book where she kept other proofs, a menu from a Liberty ship, a discarded K-ration label, a photograph of a depot sign that said supply in letters as calm as a pastor's voice. Saito returned to Shizuoka with a limp and a pocket full of silences. He learned the occupational grammar of rebuilding: shovel, nail, schedule, queue. He lit a legal cigarette one afternoon and felt the ember mark a boundary between before and after. He thought of a tent where a nurse had made tea and a Marine had offered a smoke without asking what uniform he wore, only how he breathed. He told his wife that the world, having torn, was being sewn in stitches small enough to hide. The impossible statistic waited politely for the right paragraph. It was not a drum roll. It was a ledger line. An American rifle company on full K rations, call it 180 men, could hold, open and unopened, more than 2,000 cigarettes at day's end. That single day's allotment equalled the legal daily quota for hundreds of adult men under Japan's late war coupons. And those cigarettes were incidental to the purpose of the ration, which was calories and certainty. Elsewhere, Hershey's wartime lines had turned out more than 3 billion bars, peaking at roughly 24 million in a week near war's end. Enough sweetness to outlast monsoon, coral, and fear. The numbers did not gloat. They testified. Aiko lit her first lawful women's cigarette on a balcony no larger than the stove's shadow. The smoke unrolled like a ribbon you can't tie back. She pinched it out halfway because saving was still part of breathing and put the stub in the saucer that had become an altar of small continuities. She broke a square of chocolate a neighbour had pressed into her palm with both hands and let it soften on her tongue. Waxy, sweet, ridiculous, Perfect. She closed her eyes. Somewhere, a depot clerk was writing a different kind of inventory now. Lumber in, nails out, rice accounted for. Claire visited a veterans' ward and passed out accessory packets emptied of their war and filled with stationery, stamps, silly comforts that felt like policy said kindly. She read to a man whose hands still shook until the tremor learned her cadence and settled. She thought of the way democracy had gone to war like a family runs a harvest. Everybody working, everybody fed, arguments saved for the porch after the crop was in. She thought of the handkerchiefs and cigarettes that had ridden in the same trucks as plasma and shells, and she understood again why the Ridge had given up the night. In 1950, rationing ended in Japan, and the ledger finally looked like a book you might choose to keep rather than be forced to. Aiko slid it into a drawer that did not stick. Lights burned over streets that had remembered how to sell things again. Joe stood on a stateside sidewalk and lit a smoke because old habits are maps you don't throw away, then crushed it out because the future was telling him to walk faster. Saito planted a tree and tied it to a stake with a careful knot that would not cut the bark. Claire wrote one last letter that said only, "We kept our promises, and they kept us." Between a chocolate's square edge and a cigarette's round glow, a century turned, and the lights stayed on.